She was burning with fever. But the woman in the gold dress didn't care. "You'll serve tonight or you'll lose everything," she hissed. What that maid was hiding behind her tired eyes would leave an entire mansion in stunned silence by the end of the night. Stay with me. This gets unbelievable. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you belong to? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this little corner of the internet reaches. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones I've ever shared with you. It's about a tired, sick woman who nobody in that grand mansion thought twice about, and a secret she carried for over 20 years. This story will make you angry, it will make you cry, and by the end, it will remind you what real love actually looks like. I won't tell you how it ends. You just have to stay with me. The rain hadn't stopped falling since morning, and Elena Reyes still went to work. Her hands trembled as she gripped the bus railing, her forehead burning under her worn wool coat. She'd told herself 1,000 times that morning, just one more night, one more shift, then you can rest. But rest was a luxury Elena hadn't been able to afford in years. She worked as head housekeeper for the Whitfield estate, a sprawling white mansion on the edge of Greenwich, Connecticut, owned by one of the wealthiest families on the East Coast. Robert Whitfield had built a shipping empire from nothing. His son, Daniel, had inherited the company at 32, along with a kind of quiet, steady charm that made people trust him instantly. Elena had worked for this family for 22 years. She'd folded Daniel's baby clothes. She'd hemmed his prom suit. She'd sat by his hospital bed the night he broke his arm falling off his bike, humming an old lullaby until he fell asleep, long before his own mother even arrived. Nobody in that house knew why she cared so much. They simply assumed it was loyalty. It wasn't loyalty. It was something far deeper, something Elena had buried so far down that even she sometimes forgot it was there. Tonight was the night of Daniel's engagement dinner. The entire Whitfield ballroom had been transformed, crystal chandeliers polished until they gleamed like diamonds, 100 white roses on every table, waitstaff in crisp uniforms gliding between guests. Daniel was marrying Victoria Sinclair, the daughter of a hedge fund billionaire, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ruthlessness. Elena had a fever of 102 that night. She'd taken aspirin she couldn't really afford and told the head butler she needed to sit down for just a few minutes before service began. That's when Victoria found her. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the kitchen like glass. "Is there a reason the help is sitting down while my guests are arriving?" Elena rose immediately, swaying slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I just needed a moment. I haven't been well." Victoria's eyes swept over her with open contempt. "Not well? Do I look like I care? You'll serve the head table tonight. Personally, I want my future in-laws to see how well I run this household." She smiled, cold and sharp. "Disappoint me, and you can find work somewhere else tomorrow." Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides, but she said nothing. She had a daughter's college tuition to think about. She had rent. She had no other choice. She picked up the silver tray, steadied her shaking hands, and walked into the ballroom, not knowing that this single night would tear the Whitfield family's carefully built world apart, and reveal a secret that had been hidden inside these walls for over 2 decades. The ballroom shimmered with candlelight as 200 guests raised champagne glasses in Daniel and Victoria's honor. Elena moved between the tables, her vision blurring at the edges, sweat beading along her hairline despite the coolness of the room. Every step felt like walking through water. She focused on the tray in her hands, on the china, on simply making it to the next table without stumbling. Daniel noticed her first. He'd known Elena his whole life. She wasn't just staff to him, she was practically family, the woman who'd been more present in his childhood than his own mother, who traveled constantly for work. He watched her cross the room, saw the pallor of her skin, the way her hand trembled as she set down a plate. "Elena," he said quietly, catching her wrist as she passed. Are you all right? You look pale. I'm fine, Mr. Daniel, she whispered, forcing a smile. Please enjoy your evening. But Victoria had seen the exchange from across the room, and her jaw tightened. She excused herself from a conversation with her future mother-in-law and crossed the floor with the practiced grace of a woman who'd never been told no in her life. Is there a problem here? Victoria asked, looping her arm through Daniel's, her smile aimed at the surrounding guests but her eyes cold as she looked at Elena. She's not well, Victoria, Daniel said. Maybe she should sit down. She's working, darling, Victoria said sweetly. That's what we pay her for. She turned to Elena. The Whitfields' oldest friends are at table 12. Serve them the second course. Now. Elena bowed her head and moved toward the kitchen to retrieve the next tray. Her heart pounding, her fever spiking with every step. In the kitchen, she gripped the counter, breathing hard, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. Just get through tonight, she told herself. Just one more night. She lifted the heavy tray of plates. 6 servings of seared duck breast, each plate porcelain and gold-rimmed, worth more than her weekly paycheck, and pushed back through the swinging doors into the ballroom. She made it halfway across the marble floor. Then her knees buckled. The tray crashed to the ground in an explosion of shattering china and scattered food, and Elena collapsed beside it, her body crumpling onto the cold marble as gasps rippled through the crowd. Victoria's scream cut through the silence, not out of concern but fury, as sauce splattered across the hem of her golden gown. Are you serious right now? Victoria shrieked, pointing a finger down at Elena's motionless body. Get her out of here. She's ruining everything. But Daniel was already on his knees beside Elena, his hand on her burning forehead, his voice sharp with panic. Someone call an ambulance. Now. And in her purse, which had fallen open beside her on the floor, something slipped out onto the marble. A small, tarnished silver locket, the clasp broken from the fall, and inside it, a photograph that would change everything Daniel Whitfield thought he knew about his own life. The ambulance arrived within 11 minutes, but for Daniel, kneeling on that cold marble floor with Elena's hand in his, it felt like hours. Stay with me, Elena, he said, his voice cracking. Please stay with me. Victoria stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching the scene with visible irritation rather than concern. This is a disaster, she muttered to her mother. Do you know how much press coverage this event was supposed to get? Now it'll be about the maid. Daniel heard her. For the first time in their 2-year relationship, something cold settled in his chest as he looked at the woman he was supposed to marry. But it was the locket that stopped his heart entirely. He'd picked it up without thinking, meaning to set it aside safely, when the broken clasp gave way and it fell open in his palm. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age. A young woman, no older than 19, standing outside a small hospital, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blue blanket. On the back, in faded ink, were words that made his hands begin to shake. My son Daniel. Born March 3rd. I will always love you, even from far away. Daniel stared at the photograph, then at Elena's pale, unconscious face. His mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. He'd been adopted. He knew this. His parents, Robert and Margaret Whitfield, had never hidden it from him. They'd told him at age 7 gently, that his birth mother had been young and unable to care for him, that she'd made the difficult choice out of love, not abandonment. He'd never known her name. His parents said the adoption had been closed, the records sealed at her request. He looked at the date on the photograph, March 3rd, his birthday. He looked at Elena, the woman who had worked in his home for 22 years, who had sat by his hospital bed as a child, who had somehow always known exactly what he needed before he asked. The woman his own fiancée had just humiliated in front of 200 people. Oh my God, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sirens now wailing outside. Elena. The paramedics rushed in, lifting her gently onto a stretcher, an oxygen mask over her face. Her vital signs alarmingly low from the untreated fever combined with what they'd later learn was a serious kidney infection she'd been too afraid, or too proud, to seek treatment for. Daniel closed his fist around the locket and stood, his entire body numb. "Daniel, come on, this is embarrassing," Victoria snapped, tugging at his sleeve as photographers who'd been hired for the engagement began quietly capturing the chaos instead. "We need to salvage the evening." Daniel turned to look at her, really look at her, as if seeing her for the very first time. "I'm going to the hospital," he said quietly. "You can stay and salvage whatever you want." And for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitfield walked away from Victoria Sinclair without looking back. The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, fluorescent lights humming overhead as Daniel sat with his head in his hands, the locket still clutched tightly in his palm. He hadn't told anyone what he'd found. Not his parents. Not Victoria, who had texted him 17 times demanding he come back and fix this mess. He simply sat there, replaying every memory of Elena he could summon, every small kindness, every quiet moment of care that had never quite made sense until now. When Dr. Patel finally emerged, Daniel stood so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. "She's stable," the doctor said. She was suffering from a severe kidney infection that had gone untreated for weeks, possibly longer. Combined with exhaustion and malnutrition, her body simply gave out. Another day or two without treatment, and this could have been much worse. "Can I see her?" "She's resting, but yes." Briefly. Elena's hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors. She looked smaller in the hospital bed than she ever had in the mansion's grand hallways, fragile in a way Daniel had never seen. Her eyes fluttered open as he sat beside her. "Mr. Daniel," she whispered, trying to sit up. "You shouldn't be here. Your engagement party." "Stop," he said gently, taking her hand. "Just stop, Elena." He opened his palm and set the broken locket on the blanket beside her. Elena's breath caught. Her eyes filled instantly with tears as she stared at the small silver object, 22 years of carefully guarded silence crumbling in a single moment. "I found it on the floor," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "The clasp broke. I saw the photo, Elena. I saw what you wrote on the back." "Daniel, Her voice broke completely, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I never meant for you to find out this way. I never meant for you to find out at all." "Is it true?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, had known it the moment he saw her handwriting, so familiar from 22 years of grocery lists and birthday cards signed with love, Elena. "Are you my mother?" Elena closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they held 2 decades of longing she'd never allowed herself to speak aloud. "I was 19, she said softly. "Alone, no money, no family who would help me. Your parents, Robert and Margaret, they couldn't have children of their own. A nurse at the hospital connected us. I held you for exactly 1 hour before I signed the papers, and I told myself I would never see you again, that it was the only way to give you the life you deserved. But you came back," Daniel said, tears now streaming freely down his own face. "You came to work in that house." 5 years later, Elena nodded. "I applied for the housekeeping position without telling anyone who I was. I just wanted to see you. Just wanted to be near you, even if you never knew. I promised myself I would take that secret to my grave rather than risk taking away the only mother you'd ever known." Daniel pressed his forehead against her hand, sobbing quietly. 22 years of unknowing loss and unspoken love finally finding each other in a sterile hospital room. "You've been here my whole life," he whispered. "You never left me." "Not really." "Never," Elena said. "Not for one single day." News of what happened at the engagement dinner spread through Greenwich society faster than Victoria could contain it. By morning, whispers filled every country club and charity brunch. "Did you hear? The housekeeper collapsed at the Whitfield party. Daniel left with her in the ambulance. Left his own engagement dinner. Victoria arrived at the hospital the next afternoon, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. Her face a careful mask of concern that didn't reach her eyes. She found Daniel sitting outside Elena's room, exhausted, still wearing the same suit from the night before. "There you are," Victoria said, softening her tone as several nurses glanced their way. "I was worried sick. You just disappeared." "I told you where I was going," Daniel said flatly. "Well, you could have called. Do you have any idea what people are saying? The Hendersons think we're having some kind of crisis. My mother has been fielding calls all morning." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "Victoria, do you even know her name? The woman who collapsed at our engagement party." Victoria blinked, caught off guard. "The maid. I don't, Ellie or something." "Elena," Daniel said quietly. "Her name is Elena. She's worked in my family's home for 22 years. She held me when I had chicken pox. She taught me to ride a bike. She sat with me every single time I was sick as a child, because my own mother was always traveling for the foundation." "Daniel, I don't understand why this is relevant, right?" "She's my birth mother, Victoria." The color drained from Victoria's face. "What?" "I found out last night. A locket fell out of her bag when she collapsed. She gave me up when she was 19, and she spent the last 17 years working in my family's home, quietly watching over me, never saying a word, because she loved me enough to let me go and loved me enough to stay close." Victoria's mouth opened and closed, searching for the right words, but for once, none came. "And last night," Daniel continued, his voice hardening, "you forced her to work while she had a 102-degree fever. You threatened her job. You called her the help in front of 200 people while she was one collapse away from a hospital bed." "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Daniel said. "You never ask. Not about her, not about the staff, not about anyone who isn't useful to you." Victoria's eyes hardened, her mask slipping entirely. "So what, you're calling off the engagement over a housekeeper?" "I'm calling it off," Daniel said, standing, "because of who you are when you think no one important is watching. That tells me everything I need to know." He walked back into Elena's room and closed the door gently behind him, leaving Victoria Sinclair standing alone in the hospital hallway, her perfect world beginning to crack for the very first time. Robert and Margaret Whitfield arrived at the hospital that evening, having heard the news secondhand through a frantic phone call from Victoria's mother, who was already discussing damage control and the story we tell the press. Margaret rushed into the room first, her heels forgotten somewhere between the parking garage and the elevator, her face pale with worry. She'd known Elena for over 2 decades, had trusted her with her son's life more times than she could count. "Elena," Margaret breathed, taking the older woman's frail hand. "Thank God you're all right. Why didn't you tell anyone you were sick? You could have." She stopped when she saw Daniel's face, and something in her son's expression made her go very still. "Mom," Daniel said quietly. "Dad, there's something you need to know. Something I just found out myself." He explained everything. The locket, the photograph, the words written on the back, Elena's confession in this very hospital room. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, and Robert, known throughout the business world for his unshakable composure, sat down heavily in a chair as if his legs could no longer hold him. "Elena," Margaret whispered, turning to the woman in the hospital bed, tears already falling. "You're Daniel's birth mother. All this time." Elena's voice trembled as she spoke, 22 years of guilt pouring out at once. "I should have told you. I know I should have. But I was so afraid. Afraid you'd think I had ulterior motives, afraid you'd send me away, afraid I'd lose the only chance I had to be near my son. I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm truly sorry." But Margaret did something no one in that room expected. She leaned down and wrapped her arms around Elena, careful of the 4-line in her arm, and held her the way one might hold a sister who had carried an impossible burden alone for far too long. "Don't you dare apologize," Margaret whispered fiercely. "Do you understand what you gave us? We couldn't have children. We prayed for years, and then we got Daniel because of you. And then you stayed. You cared for him like your own, asked for nothing, took nothing, and let us be his parents without ever trying to take that from us. Elena, you gave us the greatest gift of our lives twice." Robert, still seated, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show, added quietly, 22 years, Elena. 22 years you worked in our home and never said a word. Never asked for anything more than a fair wage and a room to sleep in. We should have seen how sick you were. We should have taken better care of you. That's on us, not you. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, holding his birth mother's hand on one side while his adoptive mother held the other, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be loved by more than one family, in more than one way, all at once. Outside the hospital room window, evening settled over Greenwich, and inside, a family that had been quietly connected for over 2 decades finally, truly came together. Elena's recovery took 2 weeks, during which the Whitfield family refused to let her return to the small apartment she'd been renting across town. "You'll stay in the guest wing," Margaret insisted. "And that's not a request." For the first time in 22 years, Elena wasn't the one serving meals in that house. She was the one being served, fussed over, checked on constantly by a family who suddenly couldn't do enough for her. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable, after so many years of putting everyone else first. Daniel visited her every single evening after work, sitting at the edge of her bed, asking questions he'd never known he was allowed to ask. What was she like at 19? Had it hurt giving him up? Did she ever regret staying close instead of moving on with her own life? "Never," Elena told him one evening, her strength slowly returning. "Every single day I got to see you grow up was worth any pain I felt. I watched you learn to walk. I watched you graduate. I watched you become a good man, Daniel. A genuinely good man, despite everything money and privilege could have made you instead. That was never going to be a regret. That was a privilege." Word of the broken engagement spread through Daniel's social circle quickly, and to everyone's surprise, Victoria Sinclair did not go quietly. She launched a small campaign of her own, subtle comments to mutual friends, a carefully worded interview with a local society blog suggesting Daniel had abandoned her during a family crisis, painting herself as the wronged party. But something Victoria hadn't counted on happened. The story that actually spread wasn't the one she was trying to tell. Guests who had been at the engagement dinner began quietly sharing what they'd witnessed: Victoria's cruelty toward a visibly ill housekeeper, her cold indifference as Elena collapsed, her outburst about ruined designer fabric while a woman lay unconscious on the floor. The story that spread through Greenwich wasn't sympathy for Victoria. It was horror. Her father's hedge fund clients began asking uncomfortable questions. Her invitations to the city's most exclusive events quietly stopped arriving. In the world Victoria had spent her entire life trying to rule through image and status, her true character had finally been seen, and it cost her everything she'd built. Daniel, for his part, never spoke publicly about the broken engagement. He didn't need to defend himself. He simply showed up day after day at his mother's bedside, both mothers really, proving through quiet, consistent action exactly the kind of man Elena had raised him, even from a distance, to become. 3 months after the engagement dinner, Daniel stood in front of the Whitfield Family Foundation's board, a proposal in his hands that he'd been working on every night after visiting Elena. "I want to create a new initiative," he told the room of stunned board members, including his father. "A healthcare fund for domestic workers and their families. Nurses, housekeepers, caregivers, nannies. People who spend their lives caring for others and often have no safety net of their own when they get sick. That's a significant financial commitment," one board member said carefully. "I know," Daniel said. "And we're going to fund it anyway." Robert Whitfield, sitting at the head of the table, looked at his son with an expression of quiet pride he hadn't shown in years. "Tell them why, Daniel." Daniel took a breath. "Because 3 months ago, a woman who has cared for my family for over 2 decades collapsed on our ballroom floor because she was too afraid of losing her job to admit she was sick. Because she had no health insurance that actually covered her needs, no sick leave, no safety net, despite dedicating her entire life to this family. That should never happen to anyone. Not in a house that can afford chandeliers worth more than her yearly salary." The board approved the initiative unanimously. The Elena Reyes Care Fund launched 6 weeks later, quietly at first, then gaining national attention as word spread of the story behind its name. A domestic worker who had given up her son at 19, spent over 2 decades secretly caring for him from the shadows, and whose collapse from an untreated illness had inspired a multimillion-dollar healthcare initiative for workers just like her. Elena, fully recovered by then, sat in the front row at the foundation's launch event, tears in her eyes as her son, in every way that mattered, stood at the podium and spoke about dignity, about care, about the invisible people who hold families together while receiving little recognition in return. "This fund exists because of one woman," Daniel said, his eyes finding Elena in the crowd. "A woman who taught me more about love, sacrifice, and quiet strength than anyone else in my life. My mother." The room erupted into applause, and Elena, who had spent 22 years being unseen in the very house she'd helped build a family within, finally stood in the light. Not as staff, not as a secret, but simply fully as herself. A year passed, and the Whitfield estate looked different in ways that had nothing to do with its architecture. Elena no longer lived in the small staff quarters near the kitchen. She had her own home now. A modest but comfortable house Daniel had insisted on buying for her, close enough to visit easily but entirely her own for the first time in her adult life. She still visited the mansion often, not as an employee, but as family, invited to Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, quiet Tuesday evenings when Daniel simply wanted his mother's company. Margaret and Elena had grown close in a way neither of them had expected. 2 women who had loved the same boy in different ways, at different times, finding not competition but companionship in their shared devotion to him. "I used to feel guilty," Margaret admitted to Elena one afternoon, the 2 of them sitting on the back porch overlooking the garden. "Like I was living the life that should have been yours. Raising him. Watching him grow. You didn't take anything from me," Elena said gently. "You gave him everything I couldn't. Stability. Education. A father who taught him to be honorable. I got to watch him become himself because of what you built. That's not something to feel guilty about. That's something to be grateful for. We both are, I think." Daniel, meanwhile, had thrown himself into expanding the care fund, now operating in 12 states and providing healthcare coverage, sick leave protections, and emergency support to thousands of domestic workers who had previously fallen through every safety net available to them. He hadn't dated anyone seriously since Victoria, not out of heartbreak, but because the entire experience had shifted something fundamental in how he saw the world, and he found himself uninterested in anyone who couldn't understand why that shift mattered. Then, at a fundraising gala for the foundation, he met Sarah Chen, a hospital social worker who'd spent her career advocating for exactly the kind of workers his fund was now protecting. She had no idea who he was when they first spoke, deep in conversation about healthcare policy for nearly an hour before someone mentioned his last name. "Whitfield," she said, blinking. As in the guy hoping you'll let him take you to dinner sometime, regardless of his last name," Daniel said, smiling in a way that felt, for the first time in years, completely uncomplicated. Elena watched the exchange from across the room with quiet satisfaction, recognizing in Sarah's easy kindness and genuine warmth something she'd always hoped Daniel would find. Someone who would love him for exactly who he was, not for what surrounded him. 2 years after the night Elena collapsed on that ballroom floor, the Whitfield family gathered once more in that same grand room, but this time for a very different occasion. Daniel and Sarah's wedding was smaller than the engagement dinner had ever been meant to be, warmer, filled with laughter instead of careful social performance. And at the head table, in a seat of honor beside Margaret Whitfield, sat Elena Reyes. No longer staff, no longer a secret, simply and unmistakably the groom's mother. When it came time for the traditional toasts, Daniel stood, his glass raised, his eyes finding Elena's across the room. 2 years ago in this very room, I learned something that changed my entire life, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. I learned that the woman who had quietly cared for me my whole life, who I thought was simply part of our household, was actually the woman who gave me life in the first place. She gave me up so I could have opportunities she never had, and then she spent over 2 decades making sure I never truly lacked for love, even if I didn't know where all of it was coming from. He looked at Sarah, then back at Elena. She taught me, without ever saying a single word about it, what real love looks like. Not loud, not demanding recognition, just quietly, consistently there, asking nothing in return except the chance to watch someone she loved become who they were meant to be. Elena stood, tears streaming freely down her face as she crossed the room to embrace her son on his wedding day, a day she'd once believed she might never even witness, let alone be welcomed into his family. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered against his shoulder. "I have been every single day since the moment I held you for that 1 hour 24 years ago." "You never really let go," Daniel whispered back. "Not for one single day. And I'm so grateful you didn't." Around them, 200 guests rose to their feet in applause, not for a wealthy family's carefully staged celebration, but for something far rarer. A quiet act of love that had survived 22 years of silence, one collapse on a ballroom floor, and a broken locket that had finally set the truth free. Sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones we never think to look for, quietly present in the background of our lives, asking for nothing, giving everything. Elena never wanted recognition. She never wanted wealth or status. All she ever wanted was to watch her son become the man she knew he could be, even from the shadows. And in the end, her quiet sacrifice became the very thing that healed her family, transformed a company's values, and changed thousands of lives through the fund that carries her name to this day. If this story touched your heart even a little, that's exactly what it was meant to do. Remember, never judge someone by the uniform they wear or the job title beside their name. You never know what quiet, extraordinary love they might be carrying. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button. It truly helps this channel grow. Subscribe if you're new here because we share stories just like this every single week. And if this one moved you, please share it with someone you love. You never know who might need to hear it today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.